I welcome everyone and anyone who ever listens to this recording. Now, this recording might be a bit shorter than our usual ones because it's really a very important topic, of course, but also something that is we have already mentioned in previous videos, and here we decided it's best if we make a clear, different video on this one. And the title is Emancipations. Now, Mo, who is together with us, asked me, should we use a singular emancipation or a plural emancipations? And we said, well, according to definition, you can use the plural form if it's something very particular and specific. And because of the same reason, because the ways to get liberated, there's a very particular number for it, we decided that it's best if we use plural so that we emphasize even more how important this is and that really there is no other way but these three in number. Now, why is it called emancipation? It is called emancipation because for the same reason that liberation is called liberation, this is the three types of liberation, the three types of emancipation from the slavery of greed, hatred, and delusion. Now, in order to understand how we get to these three emancipations, first we have to understand what is the whole problem, so to say. Now, we have spoken about this, that the three types of poison are greed, hatred, and delusion. And furthermore, we said that there are three types of, so to say, characteristics of reality. And several ones we have mentioned, and we always start with impermanence. Now, what does impermanence mean? Because human experience is a moment-to-moment experience. It's not a continuous line of experience, it's moment-to-moment. Therefore, there's a continuous impermanence, that things continuously change, therefore they never remain the same. Neither the elements, nor the type of consciousness, nor the five aggregates, nothing really remains the same from one mind moment to another mind moment. And we have said that, well, one mind moment is, so to say, an infinite decimal moment. This can in fact be seen when one really slows down the mental processes and investigates the ongoing consciousnesses. And then one sees that when one type of consciousness ceases and another one comes, now that is one mind moment. And because of this impermanence, one may take to look upon reality with the sign of impermanence, that whatever you might find in the world is impermanent because it's a formation, it has an origination, namely a cause, and it will at some point cease, dissolve, and it is its destination. So that was one thing that we saw, that if this is reality, so to say, and because to be free from suffering is to see reality for what it is, now this is one factuality of reality, that it is very much impermanent. Now, if we know that it's impermanent out of pure logic, there are two conclusions that we can draw from it, and those two will be the other two marks of existence. Now, say something is impermanent, but a being due to illusion, delusion, ignorance, thinks that it's permanent. I will give an example. We all know that the ultimate destination of this life is death, and we know this very much, at least the death of the body. And we know this very well because we obviously observe it throughout our lives, but when the touch of death comes to a close one of ours, we are horrified and mortified that they died. That is the point, that we knew that it is impermanent, but because we couldn't bear the reality, we said, oh, it's permanent. And then we enjoyed the sweet poison, because sooner or later it turned out to be not permanent. And therefore, if you cling to something as if it were permanent while it is impermanent, what is it called? It is called suffering. Because of clinging to impermanent things, there is suffering. And that is the second mark of reality. Now, the third mark can be understood as follows. If I know that there is suffering, I might assume, well, then I suffer. And then impermanence raises its hand and it says, well, I'm impermanence, and if you assume a self, that will be also impermanent. So therefore, we say that the experiencer, so to say, is impermanent. In other words, there is no experiencer. Instead, there is just the flow of cognition, of experience, and that is what it is. And due to impermanence, you cannot name a self. That is one way to look at it, but beyond that also, if you just look upon like a feeling, even if you say that it goes through your life and it is the same, which of course doesn't happen, but the other way you have to understand no self is the following, that you simply cannot exercise absolute control over reality. There is no self who could exercise itself upon reality, because even if there were that self, that would also be just a process, and then it's a flow of something, not something eternally there. So these are the so-called three, we might say, three marks of reality. The qualities of all existent things: impermanence, suffering, and no self. Now, if this is how we see reality, and we see that this world around us, this mundane world, whatever it gives us, it will be impermanent, it will give birth to suffering, and ultimately there is no self in all of it. If we want to get beyond these, okay, we can understand impermanence and we see everything is impermanent, but we will ask Mona, who is with us now, just because you see that things are impermanent, does it mean that you are free from them? Let's say I see that sensual desires are impermanent because they rise and fall, but does it mean that I am completely beyond them, or I have already eradicated those fetters and poisons?
No, you can, but it doesn't mean that you have, but you can.
Correct. So just because one has seen that things are impermanent, that they bring suffering, and ultimately there is no essence in things, no core, it doesn't mean that one has made it to the end. We will have a video on insight knowledges, because those are very crucial to make this translation, because if you look at it, we have these three characteristics, and one can understand this. Yes, there is suffering, and all these things in the mundane world bring only suffering, and the momentary joy, which is also suffering. And then one says, okay, I see it clearly, there's all this suffering, and I am completely disgusted and terrorized by it, but does it mean that one has liberated from it? No. Because these three realities have to become, in a way, emancipations. So you want to push them to a, so to say, climax, to a peak, where finally you can let aside all the objects of this world, of the mundane world, and finally get somewhere which is not impermanent and which is not suffering, and where not even the idea of a self comes up. So therefore we say that to these three marks of reality correspond three emancipations. Now let's take them in the order as we have said them at the very beginning. Impermanence. So let's say that one continuously contemplates impermanence, how it rises, things rise and fall because it's impermanent, how impermanent things are shocking, terrorizing, how one wants to get liberated from it, and how one becomes equanimous towards impermanent formations. And what is, in fact, impermanence? Impermanence means that there is, so to say, and we must give a so to say definition, any sign of existence. Because wherever there is a sign of existence, there is also the sign of impermanence. Because the moment some kind of formation, you have to understand when I say existence in this context, I mean formation, when something forms to be. For example, a jhana experience or something like that can be also taken as an example. At that moment when it forms, it is unavoidably going towards dissolution, unavoidably. Therefore, we see the signs of existence. Whenever there is impermanence, there's a sign of existence. And if this sign you want to get rid of, if you want to not even get rid of, transcend, that is the best word. So if you want to transcend this sign of existence, then you end up with the signless emancipation. Because in impermanence, you saw how existent things hold the sign of impermanence, and now you want to transcend it to the signless emancipation. Why is it called signless? Because it has no sign of formations. So you have to understand formation is a very general concept, but fundamentally what it means is anything that has an origination and a dissolution has to be understood as a formation. There can be like mental formations, like opinions, but there can be also like physical formations, namely animate, inanimate bodies. All these things have to be understood as formation. Whatever has an origination is to be understood as formation. And here, what you want is to, in a way, you reject all the objects of this world, and you want to enter objectlessness, figuratively speaking. And then it is called the signless. Now, how the commentary says that consciousness takes its object nirvana, and it's either a signless or the other two, which we have to speak about. And they also say that this consciousness is accompanied by joy. And also all the masters and anyone who has ever touched that, they said that is the greatest bliss. Now, and you might ask me, one way you say that finally you no longer make contact with any physical object, because we have to understand that feeling comes from contact. The moment you contact an object with the mind or with the senses, there's a feeling to it. And whatever feeling there might be, there is where suffering truly begins. And so I say that finally you release from contact, there is no more feeling, there is a cooling of all feelings. And yet you say that it is accompanied by bliss. Even when we speak about Satchitananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, there is this bliss. And you might ask, so feelings are not yet over, are they? And we say, yes, they are. Because the definition that we might give to bliss here is when there is no suffering, there is bliss. And by suffering, I don't mean mental and physical. Even in the mundane world, when you have happiness from an object, that is also called suffering, because it hasn't gotten rid of the seeds of greed, hatred, and delusion. Whereas here, we say that the mind takes its object nirvana, but truly, if we speak about signlessness, it means that there is no sign of existence. This is why it's called cessation. Why nirvana sometimes referred to as the cessation of existence, because existence means sign of formations. It is signaled. And now you move to the signless, where there is no object, really no object, so to say. And then that is why it's called the cessation of formations. And why is it blissful? Because there is no suffering. The end of all suffering is bliss. And it is not something felt as bliss. It is rather just the end of all suffering that gives truly bliss. Because there cannot be any formation. It cannot be truly a feeling to it. Because if it were a feeling, then you might rightfully ask, why is it not a formation? And it would be, but this is not included in feeling because it comes after all feelings cease, so to speak. Now, if Ma would like to ask anything or add anything to this signless, which we have not mentioned or which with Ma doesn't agree, please do so. Or if it's everything okay, then we can move to the next emancipation. Please.
Yes, Om Krishna. The one thing that did arise was it's a resultant, because you speak about that a lot.
Okay.
Meaning
right.
Nirvana is a result of, it's a resultant consciousness, if you could call it
Okay.
a consciousness.
Okay, all right. So Nirvana itself is not a resultant, but for the mind to be capable of entering the signless element, it is the result. It's not Nirvana that is the result. It is the possibility of the mind to enter the signless element that is the result. Because in the types of consciousness which are beyond this world, so to say, there is a so-called path and the fruition consciousness. That the path consciousness, what it does, that is the one which removes the fetters. And then when a certain set of fetters, according to the stage of enlightenment, is abandoned, now there are fruition consciousnesses. And in fact, in that fruition consciousness, if absorption happens, well, there are two moments for which this fruition normally arises at the very beginning. It is said so. In those two moments, truly cessation happens. So for 2 moments, there is no sign of existence in anywhere in the mind or the mind itself. This is where Bodhidharma says the mind doesn't give rise to the mind, nor to the word, nor vice versa. And so the type of consciousness through which the mind enters this signlessness is indeed resultant, because it's the result of the path consciousness. Normally speaking, it's very simple. It is a result of having abandoned the fetters, a certain set of fetters, that one can enter an absorption where there are no formations. So this is how it has to be understood. It is aroused by this type. Nirvana is aroused by these types of consciousness. This is how it has to be understood. Not that Nirvana itself is a resultant, because if it were, then Nirvana couldn't be the end of all suffering. It is a type of consciousness, the fruition, which is termed as resultant because it comes as a result of the path consciousness. So this is how it has to be understood.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Next, we said that there is suffering. That was a second mark on reality. We have to see then, if I want to, transcend suffering, and what kind of emancipation would it be? Now we have to look upon what does it mean when there is suffering. And normally we say that due to desire, suffering becomes evident. The moment there is, obviously, due to ignorance, there is desire, and due to desire, there is suffering. So the root cause still is not knowing, still ignorance, but it's not too evident there. But when desires come, suffering becomes really evident. So we have spoken about this, that due to desires, there is suffering. And if you contemplate the formations of this world as pure suffering and nothing else, then if you want to enter a peak, like a liberation, how should I say, a door to liberation, then as in the impermanence you saw the sign in all things, and then you enter the signless. Now if you see the desires in all things, and that is why it's suffering, then you enter the what? Ma could finish this sentence.
Desirelessness.
Yes, desirelessness. Now the experience might not be too obvious from this. for certain beings to say signless is more obvious than desireless. But we shall speak about their connections to each other after we finish the three. So yes, desirelessness, it's the same as the signless. In fact, it is just that it is gotten there by the cultivation of a different characteristic. And we saw, in fact, that the characteristics are not too different from each other, because from impermanence there is suffering, from impermanence there is no self. So we saw that they are very much interconnected. In the same way, in fact, the emancipations are very much interconnected, even more so than the three characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and no self. But okay, so desirelessness means that since the world has ceased to be, since there are no formations, desires don't arise, and therefore there is no suffering, therefore there is bliss. And this is how it has to be understood. This is why it's called desireless, because, so to say, there's no desire for existence in a way, and therefore the mind turns away from existence towards something which transcends formations, where there are no more formations. This is how it has to be understood. If Mo would like to add anything to this part with the desirelessness, with the desireless emancipation.
Would you go back over again, no more formations? So in a day-to-day life, you know,
Okay.
You have cats and dogs and trees and other bodies and things like that. So can you explain no formations?
Okay, so can we come back to this because it's very important, but first I want to finish the first three, because the three together will very much answer the question, and then we can go into detail, because we need the third one, which, well, I would say it's one of the most important ones. Because, of
And
course,
a favorite of ours. Yes, of course, please.
okay, so then I will ask you to remind us of the whole question. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So the third mark of reality was that there is no essence in any things. Namely, things in themselves don't hold any reality. Now, what does it mean? How should we say this? So if we speak about the human being itself, it is sometimes called the, well, Anatman. If we speak about a human being, this no self is the same as Anatman. Now, what is the difference between no self and Anatman? Anatman exclusively refers to sentient beings and their non-existent soul, whereas no self generally indicates that no phenomenon, for example, greed in beings or hatred, that it in itself doesn't have any core. Now, what is the problem with cores that I say it so much? The moment you can find any type of essence in something, you start to hold on to it. You start to crave it and cling to it. And that is why there is suffering, because you find a core, oh, that is it. For example, if you have hate toward another being, then you found a core in that being towards which you can have hatred. This is what it means. But the no self means that you have to understand, if you contemplate this, that neither does this body have any kind of soul, nor any other, obviously, nor any kind of experience. Now, for example, this is where the Buddha said, and this will indicate it very well, there is no sufferer, there is only suffering. And now you might ask me, how come? And I will say, what happens when there is suffering is simply that suffering is born in the mind. So in the cognitive process of experience, the certain types of consciousnesses arise which come with displeasure, for example, and then that is called suffering. When there is physical and mental displeasure, that is the number one type of suffering that people call, in fact, suffering. So that is what no self means, that in the cognitive process, certain type of consciousnesses arise that make it pleasurable or displeasurable, and that's it. It doesn't include any type of self which then suffers. There's no suffering. And so to say, in the mind, suffering is born. And then people call themselves sufferers, but in reality, there's only the process of suffering flowing through the cognitive process. And that's it. Now, what is a cognitive process? To cognize means to get to know. So cognitive process is when you, I might say, analyze data. Like it, not like it. That is the very easy example. But beyond that, even when you see something and you determine what it is, even if you don't have liking or disliking, that is a type of cognitive process. Or if you enter a type of jhana, you get to know the jhana. It's also a cognitive process in this sense. So this is what no self means, that neither this body nor the outside has any type of self, core. And this is in fact when you see that things just flow in their course of action, like active volition, and then its results, and it's simply just like a ping pong game in a way. Or another way is just like a stream, a well-established stream of consciousness, for example, but it has no self whatsoever due to impermanence, number one. Even if you call a self, that is also just an impermanent moment where you investigate the experience and you call it yourself, but that's it. So if you cultivate the no self, slowly understand, well, there is no self in anything, so things are essentially empty. And this is the goal, that from no self you go towards emptiness, that you see even less and less. I will give an example. So a stream enterer might see a core in sensual desire. Therefore, there is still an attachment to sensuality, the five senses, and their enjoyment. Once returner has weakened the grosser forms of sensual desire, for example, and ill will, of course, but I just want to give a particular example. So they have seen that, well, there's not much of a core there. And then a non-returner has seen that it's absolutely coreless, and therefore they cannot find a single thing that they could hold on to. Therefore, there is no clinging. With other words, the thought doesn't come to them that there is enjoyment in the senses, because they have seen that the senses in themselves are empty, like empty shells through which it's like the senses are like the course in which the water flows. The water flows in its course. So namely, when you experience with the eye itself doesn't hold any, it just performs its duty, and that's it. And therefore a non-returner cannot find any pleasure, because it sees, well, the eye is here to see, not to enjoy any sight. The ear is here to hear, not to enjoy what it hears, and so on. So simply the thought doesn't occur to them that there is anything to cling to in the senses. So this is how no self becomes evident, and it goes towards emptiness. And in fact, the emancipation, when no self is cultivated, is called the void. Well, emptiness and void are the same thing, in fact, but it is called void, so we respect this nomenclature. So emptiness or void. Now, this is very important, especially in the Mahayana tradition, because what we call Sunyata, that is this void emancipation of Nirvana. This is Sunyata, when no self is cultivated. Again, just because one sees no self doesn't mean that one doesn't, because, intellectually, even a Sotapanna already knows that there is really not much of a self in anything, but still there is a clinging. And in order to get beyond this clinging, one enters the void emancipation. And now that we saw all these three, so the void simply means again that it is devoid of formations. That is very simple. Now, as we saw all these three, we can obviously see that these are not different from each other. Why? Signless means that there is no formation. Desireless means that there is no formation, and the void means that it's devoid of formation. So in the first three, impermanence, suffering, and no self, those weren't as close to each other in relation as these three, because they describe, because formations are manifold, but nirvana, or cessation, is onefold, so to say. This is how I describe. It's a onefold reality. Therefore, formations are manifold. Therefore, impermanence, suffering, and no self show themselves in different aspects of the contemplation. Whereas in the emancipations, such a thing doesn't arise, because it is directed towards the onefoldness of nirvana. So therefore, these are really the same things, and they describe the same reality. So these are the three emancipations. Now, first, Mo, if you would like to add anything to the void emancipation, to Sunyata, and then if not, then we can answer this question with everyday life, namely the practical meaning of all this.
We'd say it's perfect. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So, how can this be seen in everyday life? Like, the question might be, if a Sotapanna is there, a stream enter, which has eradicated the first three fetters of identity view, doubtful thinking, and attachment to rituals, then how do they experience things, for example? And the answer is that, so when they are in a fruition, when they are in cessation, in the fruition consciousness, then they don't experience. Experience is over. They enter the signless, the void, or the desireless, according to the way they cultivated this insight, this wisdom. So in that moment, there is nothing. There is only the, so to say, the bliss of nirvana here and now. Whereas, when they come out of it, namely they eat, they drink, for example, you have to understand it. And even better example would be a non-returner, which doesn't have sensual desire and ill will, plus, of course, the first three are eradicated, obviously. So non-returner, let's say it's in the fruition, so there's cessation for them. So they simply don't experience it. The word ceased to be. The mind doesn't give rise to the word doesn't give rise to the mind. Everything is in samadhi, as Bodhidharma would say. But when they eventually come out of it, because they cannot sit in that for infinitely long times, so when they come out of it, simply they look at things, and for example, if there is let's say if it's a male and there's a woman form which would be enjoyed by other males, he looks at that form and simply sees, well, there's form there, these are the characteristics, for example, but simply since they have touched cessation, they simply saw how all these formations come to be and cease to be. So it's not a repulsion, but it's simply non-acceptance of the desire doesn't arise. This is simply what it means. And so they can come and go and teach, but those fetters simply do not arise in them at all. This is what it means. So they can feed their cats, their dogs, but in all things, and an arahant would be an even better example, even when they are not in cessation of existence, when they arise, as Sariputta gave the example, whenever I enter a jhana, the thought doesn't occur to me that now I enter a jhana, that now I'm absorbed in a jhana, and now I emerge from the jhana. So such thoughts don't occur don't arise in an arahant. So naturally, as it is said, their consciousness is unestablished. So they already realized Satchitananda, this ultimate existence beyond existence, this bliss of no more mental fermentations, and that consciousness which is already beyond this world. And naturally they see things as just like an empty shell, like a dusty, empty shell. That is what they see. So not a thought of greed, hatred, or delusion, or any kind of volition occurs to them. And this is how they live their life. So obviously they are not in cessation, because still they see, they taste, they smell. So they still do all these things. They walk, they do all the other things. However, they don't experience that, number one, that they do all these things, and number two, that it has any kind of permanent reality. So it simply doesn't occur to them whatsoever. And this is how they live their lives. Without any greed, hatred, or delusion, they are pure as a Buddha. If you satisfy the question, now I feel that there might be something else that Moa wanted from this. So if there's something else that we haven't mentioned yet, then please.
I feel like you went over everything.
All right. So to make a little summary of this, so we saw that existence has three unavoidable marks, no matter how great existence it is. I mean, like an immaterial realm, or fine material, or even a hell realm. Impermanent, suffering, and no self, ultimately. And when these three are cultivated and are put to a climax, then it becomes, for impermanence, the emancipation will be the signless, as no sign of existence, of formations. When suffering is contemplated and culminated, then the desireless will be the emancipation. And when the no self is cultivated, then the emptiness, the void, the Sunyata becomes the emancipation. And whoever is in cessation, in the fruition, absorption, they experience not a single thing from reality. They are absorbed in Nirvana here and now. Whereas when they come out of it, so for example, not even for a Sotapanna, simply they will not, Sotapanna means stream enterer, for them simply the thought that they could have any identity doesn't arise, or that they should do any ritual to feel better. These things, because these impurities are let aside, they don't arise in them ever again. And therefore, of course, they see the Sunyata in identity. We might say this. So even when they are not in cessation, whenever they encounter an object which is no longer the slave, to which they are no longer the slave of, to the fetters, they simply encounter them and they know them for what they are. So a non-returner will see objects and simply they are incapable of having sensual desire. They are incapable of having aversion to them, any kind of aversion. No irritation, no ill will, nothing at all. And so they encounter them and they know it for what it is. So in a way, they start to in a way manifest this emptiness in their life. So they anyway will see everything as empty even more. So the higher the stage of enlightenment, the more elevated, the more this voidness, and of course the other two are seen even in everyday life. So that is the small summary of the emancipations and their importance. Now, what is their importance? We might have started with that. We obviously said it's liberation from all this, but as the Buddha would say, it is this is how you can realize the ultimate nature here and now. So in Advaita, we might say, in fact, one who has realized the Brahman is one without feathers, because for whoever is absorbed in Brahman, indeed made the whole world cease. This is how we could put it, because for them everything became a big empty shell, fiction, so to say. So that is a small summary. If Mo would like to add anything, then please.
We just want to say to all those listening, like Krishna said, the next one we have slated for is Insight Knowledges, the next Krishna Speaks. And we're looking forward to that. And thank you for this today, Krishna. Thank you.
There is one more thing that we must add, and it came from a friend some days ago. Yes, she was like, yes, desireless, silence, it's very good, but is emptiness not a negative thing? Is it not being depressed? And we say that to be depressed means to have an object. To be depressed is a feeling. And the whole point of the no self was to transcend, to end the fermentation caused by feelings. And therefore, it's not that you become a psychopath, that you have no feelings. You are absorbed in something which is beyond this world. That is what it means. And therefore, the thought doesn't even occur in the absorption like, oh, I am alone, or I am with someone. You see, all these things of I am alone, I am with someone, I feel happy, I feel sad, these are the mundane words. It doesn't have to do anything with the void. The void, there is not a single thing which would be more blissful than any of the three emancipations, because finally all mental fermentations are ended. And simply, if one truly wants to get rid of suffering, you have to understand that suffering comes from contact, and contact comes from object that can be contacted, so to say. And then if you want to get rid of suffering, which can be suffering as in physical or mental, also happiness is a type of suffering because it's impermanent and you cling to it. And also delusion is a type of suffering, such as restlessness, not because you suffer mental, but because you cannot find a restful, a peace. And these are the types of feelings. And therefore, if you want to get rid of suffering, namely these feelings, then you have to get rid of contact. And the only way you can get rid of contact, so to say, is by entering an objectless type, being absorbed in an objectless consciousness, an unestablished consciousness for a certain period of time. And then there is no suffering there, because there is no object that could be contacted. So one enters the void emancipation, or the silence, or the desireless, and the word is that it's over, game over, and there is certainly no more suffering. And this is how it becomes, sometimes we might be asked, but is cessation not annihilation? And well, we will answer from the Advaita teaching, which is that when everything ceases to be, the true reality, what we call the self, is seen. It's not me or you, or nor the self is you or me. It is that which is the reality beyond samsara. And then one becomes absorbed and dissolved in that Brahman, Satchitananda, and it is not that everything ceases to be. The formation ceases to be. Silencelessness remains, desirelessness remains, and the voidness remains. So we have to understand it as there is the mind and there is the word. And the mind gives birth to the word by contact. The moment you contact the word, you know it's real. If you couldn't contact the word, how could you say anything about it? And what does it mean that the word gives rise to the mind? Normally it is the resultant type of consciousness that, due to previous results, one's existence is rebuilt. and then the mind is given right to by the word in this sense. So in this emancipation, in these emancipations, the whole point is that finally the mind and the word exist, but they do not contact each other. Therefore, there is what we call samadhi, and that is a very great closing statement. So shall it be.
So shall it be.